Welcome to the Center for Baptist Leadership Podcast, hosted by William Wolfe. Our mission is to cultivate courageous and biblical Baptist leadership for the 21st century. We aim to revitalize the Southern Baptist Convention from within, defend it from those who seek its destruction, and serve as a better Baptist voice in the public square.
Welcome back to the Center for Baptist Leadership Podcast. I'm your host, Executive Director William Wolfe. The Center for Baptist Leadership exists to cultivate courageous and uncompromising Baptist leadership for the 21st century, to help secure revitalization for the Southern Baptist Convention, to defend it from progressives and outside forces seeking its destruction, and to serve as a better Baptist voice in the public square. I'm joined today by Pastor Rhett Burns. Rhett, thank you for joining us.
Glad to be here. I appreciate you having me on.
Rhett, why don't you just give us a little bit of your biographical background here before we dive into the topic we're going to consider?
Sure. So I am currently living in my hometown in Travelers Rest, South Carolina, where I'm the pastor at First Baptist Church, Travelers Rest. Been here at this church for almost 2 years. Previously served at a different Southern Baptist church as associate pastor. And before that, served with the International Mission Board in Central Asia. Married, have 4 young kids. And so that's a brief introduction for me.
All right. So an IMB background. Well, appreciate your service in the mission field, brother. And today we're bringing you on to talk about a topic of great interest for many Southern Baptists, and that is increased financial transparency in the Southern Baptist Convention. This might sound like a little bit of a wonky topic for many people, but it's really important. And ultimately, the question of how we use financial resources is a matter of stewardship before the Lord. So this is a deeply Christian matter. And with that in mind, Rhett, would you mind just opening this time in a brief word of prayer?
Absolutely. Our Father in heaven, we love you. We thank you for your love for us. We thank you for your son, Jesus, and we want to make him known in our communities and all around the world. And we are grateful for the opportunity to partner with Southern Baptist churches all around our country to do just that. Lord, I pray that you would give us wisdom in how we use financial resources towards that end. I pray that you will bless the work of our convention, and I pray that you will bless our conversation this afternoon as well. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Okay, so Rhett, we're talking about financial transparency in the Southern Baptist Convention. And as it stands today, you have an amendment that you think would help us have greater financial transparency in the SBC. So let's start with this. Why do we need more financial transparency in the SBC? Can't we already get all the information we want to need at any time from our entities? Don't we know where the money's going? Why do we need more financial transparency?
That's a great question. And the short answer to the last part of that question, can't we get all the information? The short answer is no, and I'm sure we'll talk about that some. But first, I would say, kind of going back to what you were saying just a few minutes ago about the Southern Baptist Convention and our partnership to reach, our nation and the world for Christ. And what the Southern Baptist Convention is fundamentally is it's a financial partnership for missions, theological education, other ministry endeavors. And because it is a financial partnership, we pool our resources, cooperative program, and our missions offerings. Those are just some of the greatest ways to fund missions and ministry that I think we've ever seen. And because of that, that means that finances really are at the core of who we are. Now, it's not the most fun thing to talk about. I don't love talking about finances. I love talking about proclaiming the gospel to unreached peoples and unreached places. But because we are a financial partnership to fund those things, those kingdom endeavors that we all care about, we need to talk about transparency because we're lacking there. And so the reason we need financial transparency is because, as it currently stands, the Southern Baptist Convention does not meet what I would call minimum industry standards for financial disclosure. And what I mean by that is most nonprofits are required to make certain level of financial disclosure to the public, to their donors. And the Southern Baptist Convention does not do that. Now, the reason they're not forced to do that by law is because churches and affiliated organizations are not required to do that by law. But the principle still remains that our Southern Baptist churches and messengers ought to have that same level of disclosure that donors to other nonprofit organizations receive by virtue of the law. And so you ask the question, can't we find out all of that information? And the answer is no, we can't. We can find out some information. One problem with that is it's really difficult to access the information that is available, but there are ministry reports that has some financial disclosure. There's the Southern Baptist Convention annual report, which has some financial disclosure, but it's not sufficient to give us, I think, all the information that we need to evaluate our entities, financial practices, health of the organization, how the trustees are doing, managing the entity, and just kind of give us that minimum level of disclosure that every other nonprofit discloses.
That's a good way to put it. And I'd like to think that even if there weren't sort of federally regulated standards for disclosures from nonprofits to their donors, that as Christians working together, our organization, the Southern Baptist Convention, would want to make this information available to the quote unquote donors of the Southern Baptist Convention, which are the churches and which fundamentally are the people in the churches. When you sit in a Southern Baptist Convention church and they're taking up a Lottie Moon Christmas offering or an Annie Armstrong offering for the IMB and for NAM respectively, that money isn't just coming out of nowhere. It's coming out of the checkbooks and the pockets of faithful Southern Baptist givers. And so I do think that, again, whether there was an industry standard or not, I think that the idea of this basic level of financial transparency is just a Christian standard of responsible stewardship. And so another question for you, just to introduce our audience to these topics and sort of answer this question of why this is needed. If I am a NAM church planter who is maybe making, $65,000 a year, if that, as a senior pastor, can I know what Kevin Ezell is making as the president of NAM?
You cannot. You can't know that. Now, if we were to pass this amendment to the business and financial plan to require entities to disclose 990 level information, then you could, because one of the things that is not currently reported but would be reported on a 990 is your top compensation, executive compensation. It doesn't disclose compensation of everybody in the entity or organization, but it does disclose compensation for your top paid compensated employees, as well as trustees, directors, other key employees, as the 990 defines it. And so, but no, you can't learn that. The current business and financial plan in Article 14 says that messengers can request of the entity to have, there to be shown from the records of the Southern Baptist Convention entities information regarding, and it has a whole list of things, including the very last one is salary structures. And so you could, in theory, get the salary structures for all of our entity employees. And by salary structures, basically that is a range of salary that they use for different positions. Now, the problem with that is, one, it's just base salary. It's not total compensation. So that doesn't tell the whole story, which just one quick note on executive compensation. One of the reasons for that is the 990 and executive compensation disclosure is used to evaluate trustees. And we can talk more about that in a bit. But it's not just because of a curiosity about how much people make, or we think they make too much or whatever else. It's how are our trustees doing managing our resources and our missions dollars. And so that's the reason behind it on the 990. Now, as it currently stands with that Article 14, you should be able to at least get the salary structures. And you can go through the websites and maybe find the right person at each entity, the vice president of operations, for example, and email them and ask them. And you may get a response and you may not. So I and a couple of friends, we did this recently at the instruction of the executive committee to see if we could get that information. And we heard back from most of the entities, not all of them. Some of them required, that you wouldn't share this information with anybody. Some of them just said, don't put it on social media. The documents that we got were varying levels of being helpful. Most of them just kind of gave a base salary. One was from a third party. One said that the current, that what's on the sheet doesn't meet what's actual. So it really wasn't very helpful at all. But what was the most interesting in that is that the North American Mission Board and the International Mission Board both reinterpreted that Article 14 of the Business and Financial Plan. And rather than providing the salary structures as they are required and how the other entities interpreted that and how that has been interpreted in the past, what they instead did was they emailed back and said, the trustees set the salary. That's your information. And so they reinterpreted the current Business and Financial Plan to mean something that it doesn't mean, and then stonewalled and wouldn't even give you the salary structures, which honestly wouldn't be that helpful anyway, but it's more helpful than nothing. And so what I think that shows isn't that had they provided that information, we would have everything that we need to evaluate our entities and trustees and things like that. What it does show is a culture of distrust of ordinary Southern Baptists. It shows a culture of distrust of messengers, and it shows a culture of financial obscurity rather than financial transparency, even in very minimal matters. And that's what's frustrating as a local church pastor. That's what's frustrating as a lifelong Southern Baptist, is to see our missions boards, the thing we come together to fund and to partner with for mission around the world and around North America, that those two mission boards both, I would say, in ways that violate some trust, reinterpreted those and stonewalled us.
And that was just a very, recent exercise that you undertook along with some others to make a good faith effort to see what information can be made available or would be made available when it was requested. But there have been, I think, questions about financial obscurity versus financial transparency in the Southern Baptist Convention for quite a few years now. At recent conventions, we've had people stand up and ask for forensic audits of NAM. NAM seems to be one of the entities in particular that people have many questions about. And the reality there is because NAM has a lot of money, and money is power. There's no way around it. Money is power. Money is influence. And what NAM does with that money, who it goes to and who it doesn't go to, would show us what their priorities are. And it would be eye-opening for many Southern Baptists. Hey, look, if we see the books, maybe we all support it, but maybe there are some questions. Maybe there's some, ministerial drift or redirection we would want to encourage. But so what are some other reasons, Rhett, that are bringing up this necessity for financial transparency in the Southern Baptist Convention? Why is this a topic right now?
Sure. And you're right. That has been brought up over the last several conventions, and it's been shot down at all of those conventions. Either the motion has been ruled out of order, or questions directly to entity heads have been kind of deflected to a trustee who comes up and then stonewalls and doesn't answer the question. And so this absolutely is something that is building. And honestly, it's something that's building among a broad coalition within the Southern Baptist Convention. This isn't just one kind of wing of the convention that is concerned about this, but it has broad support and broad appeal because people want to know, how's our money being spent? Another way to answer that question, though, as far as why do we need it, I think broadly speaking, it's because we have broken trust in our convention. And I believe that our financial partnership, our Great Commission cooperation, it runs on trust. We have a deficit of trust right now. And one way we can rebuild that trust is to have greater financial transparency. Now, there's a whole lot of reasons why trust is broken in the SBC, and it doesn't all have to do with money, but some of it does. And so there's just been examples of where our missions dollars, our tithe dollars that have been going in through our churches, hasn't been used well. And so you think about Southeastern Seminary for 2 decades. And so you have 2 decades worth of trustees, you have 2 different presidents, and they spent, I believe it was $6 million of deficit spending a year for 20 years. It's about $120 million, if my math's right. You have, and the trustees are there. They're overseeing that, and that's happening. Now, that's not to say that 990 disclosure would have solved all of that, but it would have promoted a culture of transparency and a culture of accountability for our entities. And so that is one example. You can think recently, the trustees of the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission, they approved $250,000 to give to the Abuse Response Commission, ARC. And there's questions about whether our business and financial plan allow that. They are taking, money that has been given to them for their ministry assignment, and they're funding a new organization that is unaccountable to the SBC. And I guess they're giving it to more accurately, they're giving it to the Abuse Response Implementation Task Force. That's where it's going to finish up their work. With, the questions are, will they give it to the Abuse Response Commission? So I asked one of our South Carolina trustees of the ERLC, I was like, what's this about? And he says, it's to wrap up their work. And I'm thinking, what work? They're wrapping up. Why do they need $250,000? They still have other money in the bank for that. What could it be going to, except to be passed along to the ARC? And so there's questions. Are we doing that? Are we abiding by our written rules and bylaws and business and financial plan? Can we trust what the trustees are doing if they are thumbing their nose at what we've agreed upon to be our rules? There's think back over the years. You have Lifeway. When Tom Rayner was leaving Lifeway, one trustee, Jimmy Scroggins, authorized $1 million to Tom Rayner. The other trustees did not approve it, but he got $1 million there. While Scroggins also had 3 book contracts, reportedly, with Lifeway at the time while he's serving as a trustee. There's conflicts of interest there. You can think about the North American Mission Board and how they, there's at least questions, and I'm not an expert on this here, but there's at least questions about their funding of sin relief. Did that violate the business and financial plan about, how they're using their money there and with new entities, and the books are related there. There's some questions about the finances between North American Mission Board and Sin Relief. There's questions about North American Mission Board reportedly spending $600,000 lobbying Congress. And does that violate our business and financial plan about soliciting federal funds? Or is NAM receiving federal funds there? These are questions that I think Southern Baptists ought to know, because, again, you said it earlier, money comes with strings. You have North American Mission Board when Johnny Hunt was vice president. And there are reports of him using that position or that influence to fund businesses, to do contract work with businesses that either he owned or family owned or friends owned. And so the 990 shows these types of conflicts of interest, or the 990 shows top contractors who were given them, the most money to. And so it would potentially show those type of things and make that type of disclosure. You have instances where you have a spouse, one spouse serving on the board of trustees and another spouse working for the entity. That's a conflict of interest. And so these are the things that, some of these things might even be above board. There might be details that we don't have. Totally willing to admit that. But what you have in all of this is it creates a culture of distrust all around our money. And if we have more transparency there, we shed more light there, I think we could rebuild our trust.
Yeah, well, thank you. Those are some great examples. Some others that come to mind too, just sort of general questions would be NAM funding for church plants that are essentially operating outside of the Baptist faith and message. There's been quite a wide variety of reports showing that NAM church plants have had husbands and wives serving as co-pastors. How many egalitarian church plants have Southern Baptists funded through NAM or the SEND network that we don't know of? And another broader question too, when it comes to NAM again, would be, what is sort of the solvency rate of NAM church plants who receive SEND network or NAM church planting dollars to plant SBC churches, and then are able to attain, fiscal and financial stability on their own, and then stay in the Southern Baptist Convention? One of the glaring examples over the last decade was when NAM partnered with John Onwuchekwa to plant a church in Atlanta, and I believe that they helped finance a major loan, $100,000 to $200,000, something in that range. And then John Onwuchekwa decided that the Southern Baptist Convention was too racist for him to be a part of, and he wrote a scathing letter and left. And as far as I know, that money was never repaid. And those are just, again, a few examples. And I think when it comes down to it, like you said, the Southern Baptist Convention is a cooperative program that runs on money. There's no church planting, missions, and evangelism and training or theological training without funds being pooled and shared. And we want them to be going to Southern Baptist interests, to things that we believe should be happening as Southern Baptist. Another issue that's been raised of late has been the relationship between the SBC, particularly NAM, and Acts 29. Acts 29 is not the Southern Baptist Convention. It's a separate organization. It's having its own issues. It's advancing beliefs that do not comport with the Baptist faith and message. And we don't know how much money is going from NAM, Acts 29, to help keep them afloat as they have declining membership, as they're leaning more into egalitarianism, as they have a different vision for church ecclesiology than the SBC does. So lots of questions. Those are some really great examples, Rhett. But I think to bring it back to the bottom line for our listeners is financial transparency builds trust, while financial obscurity weakens trust and raises a lot of questions. And
then what it does, it also weakens our Great Commission effectiveness. And so if I could give you one more example. So we served with the International Mission Board. We were in a city in Central Asia. We had one other team with us, and then we're out in an unreached area, very few other Christians in that area. And this is the time when there was the voluntary retirement. I don't know if you remember that or not. We ended up, I think, losing about 1,000 or so missionaries between voluntary early retirement for some missionaries. And then also after that, there was a phase 2 of what they called a voluntary hand raising. Anybody that just felt like maybe it's time I transition back to the States, and they helped them do that. And so we lost our teammates. And so then we were alone out in our city for a good, 9 months or so, doing ministry by ourselves in that area. And okay, what brought about this voluntary early retirement and this voluntary hand raising that caused us to lose 1,000 or so missionaries? And if you add up the cumulative years of missionary service and experience, how much did we lose during that time? And that's important because it takes a lot of time when you're on the mission field. It takes a lot of time learning language and culture and best practices and all of that. And so the longer you're there, the more experience you have, the more effective you end up being in a lot of cases. And what led to that? Well, what led to it was money. We didn't have enough of it. Now, I don't want to cast aspersions on anybody or anything, but the fact is, with our trustee board there at the IMB, we ended up not having enough money to have all of these missionaries on the field and be solvent into the future. And so we ended up having to bring a lot of people back. And the issue there was finances. And so, again, I'm not alleging corruption or anything like that, but it does seem like there was at least some level of mismanagement, and that led us to that point. And so, again, more transparency leads to greater accountability. Greater accountability leads to better performance and effectiveness. And all of that is what funds and supports and makes possible our Great Commission efforts all around the world. And so, again, if we want to see this, if we want to see the gospel going out all over the world, we need to make sure we take care of things at home financially. And at least one piece of that is transparency.
Rhett, that makes a lot of sense to me. I would trust that would make a lot of sense to your average Southern Baptist pastor. And your point about the trustees not trusting the messengers, really it's the churches of the Southern Baptist Convention. And we can't have a system where the trustees themselves are above the law, so to speak. Yes, we want to trust the trustees, but trust is a two-way relationship. And for that two-way relationship of trust to be established, there needs to be accountability and transparency on both sides of things. I'm sure more examples could be given of evidence of financial mishandling across the Southern Baptist Convention, which of course is not totally unavoidable in a fallen world, right? But that's also where I think the transparency, while it certainly can't fix things in the past, it can help avoid future problems, because if you know the transparency is there, you're going to be more inclined to do the right thing, even if it's a toss-up, even if you think it could be justified, to sort of err on the side of doing the right thing and what would be justifiable to churches and messengers. And so that leads us to you and your amendment that you offered last year in New Orleans in 2023. What is the amendment, and what does it ask for the Southern Baptist Convention to do?
Sure, I'll read part of it. I won't read the whole thing necessarily, but the motion was to amend the business and financial plan such that it would require entities to disclose to the messengers, to the convention, the information that is normally made public on the IRS Form 990. And again, that is a tax return that nonprofits are generally required by the IRS to file. Churches and religious organizations are not required, though some do. There's several of our state convention entities that do file 990s here in South Carolina. But our Southern Baptist Convention's entities are not required by law. The motion specifically says that we don't want them to be required by law. They're not required to file the 990 with the IRS. Rather, this amendment to the business and financial plan will require them to give the same level of information, same information that's on a 990, make it available to the churches. And so that's the summary of that motion.
I think that's a really important point to drill down for anybody listening to this, is that the Rhett's amendment here, this push for greater financial transparency, only pertains to operations within the Southern Baptist Convention. And what Rhett is doing is using a model that's available in the public, the Form 990. And he's saying, make it like this, but also make changes and exceptions as need be, as it is, best for Southern Baptist life, and then make that available to the churches and to the messengers. So it's really only about communication within the Southern Baptist Convention from entities to the churches, like we do with so many other things. And the Form 990 is just an example that's a general example of the kind of information, the financial information that we want to see being provided. Is that correct?
More or less. So it's correct in that we don't want it filed with the government. We don't want any of our seminaries or mission boards feeling like they have to submit that to the IRS. The way the motion reads, it would be saying we want the exact same information. We don't want to leave it up to interpretation, because we've seen how things are interpreted sometimes. So the motion would require them to disclose what's normally made public on the Form 990. There are things that people file with the 990, different schedules. Some of those are not made public. And so, for example, the motion specifically excludes the Schedule B, which is the list of donors. And so we're not asking for donor information to be made public, but we are asking for all the other things that would be on the 990, your contractors, your conflict of interest statements, and lists of who key employees or officers, trustees, interested persons, I think is the terminology the 990 uses, that are being paid, your executive compensation, things of that nature. All that should be made because it is the industry standard for nonprofit financial disclosure.
And just to be extra clear here, you're not asking for it to be made public. Not only are you very clear that this isn't about Southern Baptist Convention entities and the government, but we're not asking that this information just be made generally public, but rather that it be made available to Southern Baptist churches. Is that correct?
Yeah. So the language in the motion itself, it does say publish. And so that could be within, maybe the book of reports there at the convention, on a website, in some nature where churches can access it. I'd be happy if it was behind a password or somewhere you got to use your Southern Baptist, ID to get it. But it would be published in a way that churches and messengers would have access to it.
Yeah, that's right. And again, that makes sense that the churches and the messengers could have access to it. I think it'd be more than reasonable for it to be, protected in some ways, so that only Southern Baptist churches and messengers could have access to it. And it would also...
I'm sorry. I was going to say, speaking of protections, one objection that I've heard has been just about making sure we're protecting our missionaries and their identities. And with that, I don't think that any of our missionaries would, any of our field missionaries, they're not going to be meeting the criteria of anybody that's compensation would be reported, therefore their names wouldn't be on there. However, I've made clear to the executive committee and anybody else that'll listen that having served in a Muslim country where we took security very seriously, I understand those concerns, and I would be happy for there to be some sort of amendment to that to, redact any, active field missionaries' names from from the published report. We certainly don't want to put any of our work in jeopardy or at risk. And so whether that's missionaries' names or other information related to IMB pay and things like that, as far as organization names, I'll be happy for all that to be redacted.
Okay, so it's an amendment to amend the business and financial plan. That's correct?
That's correct. Yes, it deals with the business and financial plan.
Okay, and then what this would make available to the churches and to the messengers, in some way, shape, or form, would again be sort of run us through sort of what it would be made available. So is total revenue in and expenditures out on an annual basis, is something like that going to be captured in this?
Absolutely. So you have your basic program level financials, you have your revenue, your expenses, your assets, your liabilities. There are questions about your mission, your significant activities, questions about governance, accomplishments, those things, number of employees, and a lot of that information, not all of it, but a lot of that, particularly when it comes to just the big numbers of revenue, expenses, liabilities, all of that is found in the annual report. And so you can find that already. The things that are on the 990 that are not currently disclosed are your top contractors. Who are we paying the most money to? The executive compensation, which again, that is so that we can, the messengers approve trustees. And that is a mechanism by which messengers can then evaluate trustees that they have the responsibility to appoint. How are we doing on that? And so an example of that would be, if at a seminary, if enrollment is going down, but executive compensation is skyrocketing, well, that's a problem. Or if revenue is going down, but executive compensation is going up, well, then that's a question we need to address with the trustees. And so that's on there. And again, conflict of interest statements, questions about, do you have a conflict of interest policy, and other questions surrounding that, and transactions with interested persons, trustees, and things of that nature are included as well. Another thing that I think is interesting, particularly for the time that we find ourselves in, is legal fees. How much you spend on legal fees. Now, it's not that we mind our entities spending money on lawyers. You got to do that, part of doing business. But there have been a lot of questions over the last several years about how much of our mission dollars are we spending on lawyers and legal fees around sexual abuse issues. And so that is something that would be reported on the 990 that I think is of particular interest to Southern Baptists right now.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And again, it sounds to me like this would be a way to strengthen our cooperation. I think one of the ways that Southern Baptists have sort of failed to steward the entirety of the Southern Baptist Convention over the last decade or so, or however long it's been, has been by taking a very, very, very hands-off approach to the trustees. Yes, we approve the trustees, and when we do want to trust the trustees, but getting a little bit more clarity on how the trustees are doing their job and managing these entities and institutions would be helpful to us. And we don't have a Presbyterian model here. The trustees are not ruling elders over the Southern Baptist Convention. The messengers, have the opportunity to weigh in. The messengers, I believe, have the right to, vacate boards of trustees if they felt so inclined, and so I think that this would strengthen that relationship and really help create more of a synergistic, to use that term, relationship between trustees and the messengers to build more trust. So
I'm sorry to interrupt. I was going to say, it's just a fact that people perform better when they have accountability. That's just across the board, no matter what you're talking about. And so I think our trustee boards will function more effectively and give greater governance on behalf of Southern Baptist messengers and churches if there's greater accountability in these matters. And so I think it's a no-brainer in that way.
Yeah, I agree entirely. And so that's the motion. That's the amendment. You've explained what it is and what it does. You offered it last year. And so what's the process for how does this move through Southern Baptist life?
Sure. So in New Orleans, the motion was referred to the executive committee. John Whitehead stood up and tried to get that brought out where we could vote on it in New Orleans. But at that point, once it's referred to the executive committee, it would take a 2/3 vote to get it brought out where we could have voted on it in New Orleans. Unfortunately, that vote did not get 2/3, and so it was referred to the executive committee. They invited me to come and speak to it, which I was grateful for. I will go ahead and say this at the very start: the finance committee, the subcommittee of the executive committee, has treated me very kindly. They've been, I think, doing things really well as I contemplate this. But they originally invited me to come up for the September meeting. That was around the time right after that invitation was extended. That was when Willie McLaurin left as being CEO of the executive committee, and so things were kind of upended a little bit, and so they pushed it back to February. However, it's my understanding that entity heads were allowed to address the finance committee about this motion and express their position on it during that September meeting. And then in February, I was allowed to go and speak for 5 minutes and then answer some questions, which I was grateful for. I thought it was a good meeting. And again, they treated me very fairly, which I'm grateful for. Heard my case for it in those 5 minutes, heard me answer some of the questions during that meeting as well. One entity head also was invited to speak in reference to it and spoke against it. And so after that, they went into executive session. And during that executive session of the finance committee, they decided to not take any action in February, but to punt until the June meeting, which I believe it takes place the Monday before the convention. At that point, what the finance committee will do, they will either kill it in committee, and that's it, if they kill it in committee, or they can bring it out to the full board of the executive committee, who can then either vote to bring it to a messenger vote, or they can kill it there at the executive committee. If it doesn't get brought out, my understanding of parliamentary procedure is that we can't necessarily do anything with that motion, but maybe make the motion again and try to get it voted on. But if they do bring it out, they could bring it out with a recommendation to adopt it, which is what I think is the right thing to do, which is what I hope that they do. Or they could bring it out like they did the Mike Law amendment last year and bring it out for a vote, but recommend that we don't adopt it. That's an option as well. And I'm not exactly sure how this would work, but I think there's a possibility that they will not bring out my motion, but bring out something similar, but different. That's a possibility as well. Though I would argue that anything less than 990 level disclosure is insufficient. And so my hope is that they bring it out for a messenger vote. I believe this is something that calls for the messengers. It's a responsibility of the messengers to vote on this. I understand. I think we should have voted on it last year. However, I understand that you could say, hey, before we make a major financial change, before we make a big change to our business financial plan, it's a good thing to stop and let's evaluate it. Let's evaluate it legally and everything else. Make sure there's no unintended consequences. We've made major changes in the last few years that have had unintended financial ramifications for our convention. And so that's fine. But seeing that there's no legal issues with it and other things, that it's well within our rights as messengers to vote on this, then I think it's their duty to bring it out for a vote. Anything less than that, I think, is a failure of leadership. It really needs to be brought out for the messengers. This is not a decision for entity heads. This is not a decision for the nominational bureaucracy. This is not a decision for the executive committee. Their decision is whether we should have financial transparency or 990 level transparency or not. Their decision is this legitimate for a vote? And the answer to that is yes. The right thing to do is allow us to vote on it, and I hope that they do.
Well, I agree entirely. This is such an important question right now, and how the Southern Baptist Convention is going to operate is, are we going to operate according to the will of the messengers? And are those who are in charge going to respect the will of the messengers and humbly defer to the gathered body that takes the time to, out of their schedule, out of their life, to come together every year and vote on important issues facing the Southern Baptist Convention, or they're going to respect them and do their job, which is not to serve as some sort of enlightened, small bureaucratic panel making decisions for 47,000 churches, but to put the question before the messengers: trust the Lord, trust the messengers, trust the churches, and let's work as we are intended to work as Southern Baptists, as a democratic body. And so I think you're absolutely right. I believe that they should bring it out, whatever their personal opinions are on it. And to your point about the entity heads, it would also be staggering to see if for some reason, that the, 6 to 9 or however many entity heads sort of work together to kill this. And so essentially we get the will of 9 entity heads circumventing even the possibility of the messengers to weigh in on it. And that really raises the question of who works for who here. Yeah. Are we, the messengers, just sort of a tithe farm for the entities, or do the entities serve the messengers and serve the churches? And the answer to that, fundamentally, philosophically, is that the entities in the Southern Baptist Convention serve the churches. The churches do not serve the entities. And this question will be, I think, a great test of where we stand on that currently as the Southern Baptist Convention.
You talk about violating or betraying trust. If the entity heads coordinate to kill this, that really is going to break trust with churches and messengers. I mean, I'm seeing it, on the ground with, we have people trying, they want to come join our church. And one of their questions in our membership interviews is, what about the Southern Baptist Convention? I don't want my tithe dollars going there because of this, this, and this. And lack of transparency is one of those things. And so it's affecting us on the ground as local churches. Also, when I was at the executive committee meeting in February, I listened to Jonathan Howe give his report, and he talked about, I think it was maybe 10,000 churches over the course of 15 years that have disengaged from cooperative program giving. Now, I have no idea of the reasons for all of those, but I can imagine that a good many of those, that the issues that we've talked about so far in this conversation, including transparency, would be among those reasons why people do not trust the Southern Baptist Convention, and therefore they're just saying, all right, I'm out. We're not giving. And I think we can expect more of that if we continue to stonewall the messengers and churches and not give them the bare minimum level of information that they deserve.
I couldn't agree more. So, Rhett, that's where things stand. But let's deal here in some of the remaining time with some of the top objections to this, and see if we can dispense with the bad arguments, that exist out there. And so you wrote a piece for the Center for Baptist Leadership. We published this a couple of months ago at this point, or 6 weeks or so, how increased financial transparency can rebuild trust in the SBC. And you actually tackled 13 objections that you've heard so far to this process. We don't have to cover all of those, but let's try to hit some of them here. And so let me pull it up here. So the first objection, that it's not right to disclose the salaries of all SBC employees. What's your answer to that?
This motion would not require anyone to disclose the salaries of all SBC employees. That just is not what the 990 does. What it does disclose as far as compensation is your officers, trustees, which our trustees don't receive pay for serving on the boards anyway, but our officers, trustees, key employees. A key employee is anyone making over $150,000 and controls 10% of the organization's either assets or budget or activities. And is one of the top 20 compensated employees of the organizations. That's the definition of a key employee. And so your Greek prof at the seminary, his name's not going to be on there. Your missionary serving in, the middle of Africa somewhere, their name's not going to be on there. It's not all SBC employees. It is executive level compensation.
Yeah, that makes sense. We already touched on this next one. Disclosing salaries will put international missionaries in danger. As a former international missionary advocating for this, you say clearly, no, it won't. And if there's any concern that it possibly could, we could amend it to clarify it even further. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And then, so the business and financial plan already requires entities to provide salary scales to any SBC church member who requests it. Well, we know how that goes. We covered that earlier.
Good luck.
Right. We should just trust the trustee system. Financial oversight is why we have the trustees. I feel like we've touched on this already quite a bit in this conversation. But your point here is that this is actually designed to help the churches and the faithful SBC lay members evaluate the trustee boards.
Yeah, we appoint the trustees. I think we ought to have the information we need to evaluate how we're doing. How are we doing appointing trustee boards? And I think the 990 is designed to do that. So for example, we have audits, and audits are good as far as they go. They tell you if the receipts add up. They don't tell you all this other information that we're talking about. Audits are designed to help management make sure that, again, that all the receipts add up and none of the money's missing or unaccounted for. But the 990 is not designed for that. The 990 is designed for more broad level evaluation of organization, board of trustees, and things of that nature to determine just kind of broad level financial health and trustworthiness.
This is a good one here. You tackle the objection. It would be too time consuming and expensive for entities to disclose 990 level information. What's your answer to that, Rhett?
Well, I would say that we're not asking organizations to be required, to be exempt from the law that where they have to, file with the IRS. And so we're also saying they're not exempt from the law of non-contradiction. And so what I mean by that is two things can't be true in the same way at the same time. It can't be that it's too time consuming to get this information, and also at the same time we're already giving you this information. And I've heard both of those sometimes within the span of 3 minutes from an entity head talking about, oh, we already report everything that you need to know, and it will be way too time consuming and expensive to do this. And both of those things can't be true at the same time. But particularly on that one about the expense, if you're already doing audits, if you're already doing corporate level financials, then it shouldn't be very much more work in order to put it into a 990. Corporate accountants are used to doing that. The ones that work with nonprofits are used to doing that all the time. I've spoken with the executive director of a very large pro-life organization in DC, who's a friend of mine, and just asked her, because they do a 990, how much, if you're already doing these things, how much work would it be? And the answer was, it wouldn't be very much extra work at all. They're already doing the information's already there. All you have to do is publish it. And that's what we're asking them to do. And so I just think that's a stonewalling tactic.
Yeah. So opponents there have to pick and choose which one is it. Is it that all this information is already, supplied in just maybe a different manner? Or is it not supplied, which it isn't? And how time consuming or costly would it be to supply it? And the answer is it wouldn't be time consuming. It wouldn't be costly. Yeah. This is, again, sort of just a basic hurdle to clear so that we can have greater trust and transparency in our organization. I think this is going to be one of the key things that will be trotted out as an argument against this. I think this is a red herring argument. It distracts from the reality. But 990 level disclosure makes it more likely that the federal government will require our entities to file the actual 990 with the IRS. What do you say to that?
That one just strikes me as silly, because the law is the law. Unless they change the law, the test case for whether that we file or not is, it's not how much disclosure that we have. The test case is the relationship between the entities and the Southern Baptist Convention. And so it has no bearing at all. And again, I would say, if on the one hand you're saying, we already disclosed this information, and on the other hand, you're saying, but if we disclose it, they're going to make us file it. Well, those two things don't go together and make very much sense. But as far as legally speaking, we're legally exempt. It's not like they're going to come along and say, oh, well, you're already given this information in the book of reports. Now you got to file it with us. That's not how the legal process works on that.
Yeah, that argument doesn't really hold any water. The federal government is not going to make some, random change to vitiate the religious organization exemption just because all of a sudden Southern Baptist entities start making some of this available to our churches.
Yeah.
I don't think that holds any water. Okay. And then I think this is going to be another major one that is going to be used as a weapon to try to defeat your motion, Rhett. And it's, what about keeping donor information private? And so what do you say to that?
I would say read the motion. I mean, I pull it up right here. It says, this does not require any entity to file a 990 with the IRS. We already covered that. Or to disclose information that is not normally available to the public, such as Schedule B. Schedule B, what is that? That's the list of donors. We're not asking for donor information. Now, I don't think it would be a bad thing to have, foundation gifts and things like that. I think that would actually be healthy, but that's not what we're asking for. And we're certainly not asking for individual donors. I can imagine many situations where you have somebody works at a large corporate job, secular organization, secular company, donates for ultrasound machines to the ERLC. That's made public. That somehow somebody finds that, it causes them a lot of problems at work. I get that. Nobody wants that. That's why we specifically excluded it. And so donor information is irrelevant to this conversation because we're not asking for it.
Yeah, well, that's great.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. I think that is a scare tactic here because it is explicitly excluded in your motion. And so pay attention if you're listening to this, if you're Southern Baptist pastor or messenger lay member, or if you're any of our institutional leaders who are listening to this, if the executive committee the financial subcommittee or the executive committee come out and say that they can't do this because they don't want to disclose donor information, that is entirely irrelevant. That is false. That is not a live and actionable argument because Rhett drafted and worded his amendment in such a way as to exclude that. And I'd encourage you to go read this article and all these objections. We are actually going to republish just the objections piece at Center for Baptist Leadership. Make sure to distribute that to your friends and fellow advocates for financial transparency in the Southern Baptist Convention. Because as it stands today, I've not heard a good argument against doing this, Rhett. And yet I am concerned that the messengers are not going to get a chance to vote on it. And so, as we wrap up our time here, what would you say, to that? Have you heard any good arguments against it? And what would be sort of your closing exhortation to the executive committee on allowing us to have a vote on it?
Yeah, I really haven't heard any good arguments. I put 13, I believe, objections in that piece. Those are the main ones that I have heard. And I think with all of those, they're good answers. And I would encourage listeners to go and read that article. And so, no, I haven't heard a compelling reason. If I'd heard a compelling reason why we shouldn't have done this, I wouldn't be having this interview with you right now. I'd drop it. I don't want to do anything that's harmful to the Southern Baptist Convention. I want to help the Southern Baptist Convention rebuild trust so that we can get back to the work of reaching the world and our nation with the good news of Jesus Christ. That's what I want. I want to be I want our church to have confidence that when we send our 10%, and we still give 10% to the cooperative program, that when we do that, we can do that with confidence that it's being stewarded well. I want us to, with confidence, be able to send church members that are pursuing ministry to one of our seminaries, to partner with our missions organizations. And that's my heart there. And I'm concerned that if we don't address these financial issues, along with some others, but the financial piece being an important one, if we don't address that, then we're not going to have the same convention that we inherited from our fathers and mothers in the faith. And so I want to honor our fathers and mothers in the faith by taking good care of our convention. I think of our finance chairman here at the church. He's 81 years old. And he keeps meticulous records of our finances, and he carries around a thick manila envelope with the financial information, to our deacons meeting and finance meetings. And anything you want to know about the finances of the church, he'll tell you. And he'll probably tell you more than you want to know. But he'll tell you what it is because we're transparent. And there, you go into the vestibule of our church on the way in or way out on any given Sunday. You can pick up a copy of our church budget. It'll include my compensation in it. We're transparent, and we want the same standard of transparency applied to the Southern Baptist convention. And so you asked about kind of a closing exhortation. My message to the executive committee, specifically those who serve on the subcommittee, is let's do what's right. I want you to do what's right. I believe what is right is to bring this out for a messenger vote. It is a responsibility of the messengers. I think our polity demands that. I think the scriptures commend financial transparency and walking in the light. I think it will rebuild trust. I know that there are, concerns that this will stir up more distrust, but I think that's not what the light does. What the light does is it lets everybody see clearly. And so if there is not any kind of financial mismanagement, there's all sorts of accusations of that now and hints of that now. But let's say that, it'd be great to have greater transparency and find out that those things are not true. And if there's not, then nobody has to worry about anything. But if there are, then that'll let us see clearly and we can make the necessary corrections. But nothing is helped by walking in darkness. Everything is helped by walking in the light. And so my encouragement to the executive committee and finance committee is one of gratitude. I appreciate how you're taking this seriously. I appreciate the fairness with which you have treated me. I appreciate how you have weighed the arguments and are continuing to do that. And my prayer is that as you come to June, that you will do what is right by God's word. You'll do what is right by our convention, and you will give the messengers a vote on this. If it comes out to a vote and the messengers vote it down, I'll be really disappointed, but I won't feel like anything was not done right. But if we don't get a vote on it, that's a different story, because I think the right thing to do is to allow the messengers to speak to this issue.
Well, amen to that, brother. Thank you for your work on that. One of the signs of a fragile and hurting institution is that it can't stomach or engage in good faith and honest and open debate. And so if there is a debate to be had on the question of, do we want more financial transparency? Do we want this kind of financial transparency? Then we should have this debate. But if the entity heads and the executive committee essentially collude to prevent that debate, I believe not only is that disrespectful to the messengers, but it's a sign of weakness. It says that we can't have this debate. The more honest and forthright, the manly thing for them to do would be to say, let's have the debate, and we recommend against it. Here it is. It's on the floor. Here's our arguments against it. You make your arguments for it, and let's let the messengers decide. And that's not something we've seen much in the Southern Baptist Convention of late. And I will say that I do appreciate, of course, the fact that they did that with the law amendment. And I think that's a very important analogy here, Rhett, is that the executive committee said, don't pass the law amendment. And the messengers said, no, we want it by an 80% margin, more or less. And then I think that sort of reveals a disconnect between the thinking and the mindset of many brothers and sisters serving on the committees and the positions of authority and power in the SBC, and the thinking and the mindset of the average messenger from the average SBC church. And I think it would be quite a missed opportunity to prevent us from having the same opportunity to debate and engage on this issue in 2024 in Indianapolis. And so with that, I would say to our listeners, if you're a Southern Baptist and you're a pastor and you need to come to Indianapolis, you need to max out your messengers, register to come, get informed on these issues like the amendment, reach out to Rhett. Rhett, how can people contact you?
You can contact me. You can go to our church website and find my contact information, trfirst.org, on Twitter at Rhett_Burns. That's RHETT_BURNS. Those are probably the best ways to find me.
Okay, great. And you're happy to answer any and all questions from your fellow Southern Baptists on this. Making yourself available and transparent.
There we go.
Yeah. And I think one other closing thing, and I'd be interested in your take on this too, Rhett, would be, we expect this at the local church level. I mean, your church is a model. Maybe not every church does that, but I think the basic expectations from members at a church is that the church is transparent with them on their financials. And so then why, as we extrapolate that out to the convention, does not the churches of the convention, which are the members of the convention, why would they not have the right and the ability to sort of access the same level of financial transparency from the entities? We expect it at local churches. Should we not expect it at the convention? What would you say to that?
I would say absolutely. I think we should. I think that same standard should apply. I would make one note to say we're not saying that every messenger or every pastor of every church ought to have the same level of information that, say, trustees do, or the the VP of finance or operations at an entity. We're not saying that everybody ought to have access to everything. We know that that's not workable, but we do believe that we should have the minimum standard that nonprofits are normally required to disclose, because that's what's needed in order to evaluate the financial practices, health, and trustworthiness of an organization. So we're not asking to have, just open up and let every member of every SBC church see everything. That's not what we're asking for. We're asking for a very limited amount of transparency and kind of bare minimum. And that's what the 990 represents. That's what the 990 is. That's what we're asking to let messengers vote on.
Okay, that's great. Yeah, that's a better analogy here, because we're not trying to create a system where we have, 12,000 trustees, essentially. That's not what we're asking for. So thank you for the correction there. Well received. But the point is that this minimum standard does then equip the churches to not only, hold the entities accountable, but to work more cooperatively with the trustees and the entities. And back to the point you keep making is have the trust that the money they're sending is being used to further the gospel mission, the general Christian gospel mission, of course, that we're advancing the true gospel, but that we're doing it in our distinctly Baptistic way, that we're taking the Southern Baptist mission both around this country and across the world for the sake of the glory of Jesus Christ. Amen. Rhett, anything else you want to say here before we end?
The last thing that just came to mind there is, again, want to rebuild trust within the Southern Baptist Convention, and that includes, I want to trust the entities that we give money to. I also want them to trust us. I want the entities to trust messengers and churches. And so I think we're going to find out if they do or not come June. But amen to what you just said. The goal of all of this isn't some tax form. That's not the point. The point is we need that level of disclosure as part of supporting and furthering our Great Commission cooperation to take the good news of King Jesus to every people and place in the world. And that's what we're about.
Amen. Well, Rhett, brother, thank you for your service in the Southern Baptist Convention. Thank you for your work at your local church and your effort advancing this amendment. Again, if you're in the Southern Baptist Convention, if you know anybody on the Executive Committee Subcommittee on Financials, make sure to reach out to them. If you know your Executive Committee member, reach out to them and tell them that you want to have a chance to vote on this. And to help ensure that we can do that if we need to, then you need to be at the Southern Baptist annual meeting, June 11th to 12th in Indianapolis. Make sure to check out Center for Baptist Leadership. You can find us at centerforbaptistleadership.org. Follow us at Baptist Leaders and find our podcast on all major podcast platforms. We will, I'm sure, circle back to this topic before the annual meeting in June, as well as work to equip you as Southern Baptists to be informed and engaged and educated on all the major issues facing our convention as we lead up to the meeting. Thank you for joining us, Rhett.
Thank you.
The Center for Baptist Leadership podcast is powered by American Reformer, hosted by William Wolfe, with audio production by Jared Cummings. Our music is a custom remix of Soldiers of Christ in Truth Arrayed, the official hymn of Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. To help CBL reform and revitalize Christian institutions, please consider making a generous donation today at centerforbaptistleadership.org.